Hey folks, it's Bear Gardener, and it's time for another updated new player deck guide. So, as usual, I am a Cards Content Creator, member of the Cards Contributor Program, and a major advocate and provider of new player content for this game. If you haven't already checked out my beginner guide, which is at the top of this playlist, you probably should, because it gives you a lot of the foundational stuff about what I suggest you do. But to get the big one out of the way, these decks will work. The base decks are completely guaranteed to be craftable for you, or at least assemblable. There's no crafting required. If you joined at or after covert operations and have got all 5 of your nations to level 12. Once that's done, you have the full available free collection in the game. And I always recommend it's the first thing you do because it gets you the maximum possible cards available for free. So get all your nations to level 12, and then you start like opening packs and crafting cards if you need to. But that's a great starting point, and is the starting point I've used for these decks. Base decks all are craftable or assemblable using only the cards that you have from these starter level 12 decks. And then I go on to explain those decks, how to play them, tactics, and then I explain the deck that I recommend you aim for and give a crafting path to get there, all of which is just designed to give you some direction as you go. Today we're going to be doing Britain. It's going to be Britain with US ally, and we're going to be focusing on the air archetype. So let's go take a look at the basic bare bones British air deck. Okay, so here we are in the game client, and this is on an alternative account which only currently has access to the cards from the starter and level 12 decks, which will be visible when we get to the later deck, but also it means that I know for a fact that you're looking at a screen to prove that if you are post-covert operations and have all of your nations to level 12, you have access to the same pool of cards. You can make this deck. The import code is down below. You can import that in. I recommend you do, and do the same for the late game deck when we get later to give you a guide to aim towards. This is Brit Air. Does exactly what it says on the tin. The intent is to use aerial units to take advantage and win the game. Early on, we also make use of kind of a lot of buffs and ground units, but this deck is very functional, and I will run you through each of the cards and explain what they're there to do. And then at the end we'll talk tactics. So, first card in this deck is the Desert Rats. This card isn't going to stay with us, but early on in the game it can be very useful. It is kind of multifunctional. So first of all, it is a pin card, which means that it pins a unit so that it can't move on your opponent's next turn. But it also deals 1 damage to that enemy unit, which means it can be used as a way of quickly removing 1 health threat that you're particularly worried about. There are certain Japanese aggro decks in particular will use a lot of 1 health units, and just being able to remove it for 1 cost is not terrible. Swordfish. This is a card which we'll be getting more of. Oh, we only have 1 at the moment. This is a 1-op cost, 1-op cost, 1/3 bomber, and is kind of one of the heart points of this entire deck. We like bombers because bombers allow us to hit the enemy HQ, even if they have guards up, as long as we can deal with any fighters that we come across. We also like the Swordfish because it is a 1/3 body, which means it's got enough toughness to not be super easy to remove. It is a limited card, we only have 1 of them at the moment, but it's a good card, you're never going to be sad to see it. Naval Power. This is a very useful order. 1 cost, again it's pin, but this time it gives your HQ plus 3 defense. We like to see this because it gives us the longevity to set up our big turn with our bombers and buff our bombers up to be able to take out the enemy. Bit of extra HQ defense does not do us any harm, and pinning is critical early on because you need to slow your opponent down long enough to be able to win games. First card from our US allies is the M8 Greyhound. We're taking all of them that we can from there because this card is really, really useful for us. It's a 1 cost, 1 op cost, 1/3 blitz tank, which means that you can get it into the front line for 2 credits, into the front line and swinging for 3 credits, although really swinging for 1 point of damage is not what we're in this card for. But it is a 1/3 body, which means that your opponent has to get through it to be able to get their units to your bombers, and also it has, while in the front line, units in your support line have +1 attack, which is going to be all of your aircraft and bombers. This is a great card. We're going to be leaning on this a lot early in the game to get its position, and we're going to be using some interesting tricks with buffing this using close air support. This is the Gladiator Mark 1. It's the Swordfish, except it's a fighter. It's great for all of those reasons, because this is good for giving some protection to our bombers from, for example, enemy bombers, but also gives us another unit that can kind of combat different threats, and if we buff it up, we can use it to try and remove enemy fighters. It's a good include for the moment. Having some fighters on the board isn't a bad shout. We like better ones, but it's good. We've got For Freedom. This card is just great value. It's just incredibly good value. It's 1 cost, target a unit, that unit gets +1/+1, and you draw a card. We love this card. The US ally loves this card and runs it in my US frontline decks. We're always going to have access to it. We will eventually run 2 of these. It's just really good value. Being able to buff a unit and draw a card is great, because card draw is hugely important. Cup of Tea. So this gives our units some longevity while we're kind of dealing with early rank climbs. The 1 cost order that gives all of your British units +2 defense. We are going to be using this to just keep our units alive, which is going to be something I'm going to have to do early in the game. With this deck, you will make use of this order quite regularly to just give your bombers and fighters and other units enough defense increase to keep them around. Close air support. This is an absolutely integral card to this deck. It's a 1 cost order, and it says target friendly British air unit and its adjacent units get +1/+1. Now, this is critical because playing this card well is how we win games. Classic example of ways that we can do this is being careful with the positioning of our units. For example, if we've got a couple of British aircraft on the board, let's say we have a Gladiator and a Swordfish, and we're about to deploy a Greyhound to take the front line and protect them. When we put the Greyhound down, the first thing we do is we don't push it into the front line. If we've got the spare credit, we make sure we put the Greyhound on one side, not in the middle, of one of the fighters, so that or aircraft, British aircraft, so that you can target a central British aircraft and get both the Greyhound and the other British aircraft with the buff. At which point, your Greyhound is a 2/4 that you can push into the front line, which is much more survivable, and you've effectively given +2/+2 to both of the units that you just hit, because the Greyhound is giving them +1/+1 by being in +1 attack rather by being in the front line. Using this card well is the heart of this deck, and learning to use this card well is how you will win a lot of your games. Close air support used well is absolutely value. War Machine. Spend 2 credits, gain an extra credit slot. This is just a way of getting us more credits to operate. It's not integral to what we do, but it can be useful, and it's never bad to have more resources. So early on, this is something we do not mind having from our US ally at all. His Majesty's Chosen. Choose 1 of 3 random elite British units to add to your hand. We're going to come back to this later. I will do a section on this card on its own, talking about the cards you can get from it and which ones you might want, because you get this card included in your level 12 deck. All of the nations do. They get their version. Every nation has a version of this card. Different name, same effect. And it's worth using early on in the game because it lets you get an extra elite unit. you don't have otherwise. However, a lot of these don't stick around into my late game decks. They are random, and random is never that great. But for the moment, we can definitely get value from it. But as I say, we'll talk about it at the end. The Albacore Mark 1. This is another bomber. This is 2 cost, 1 op cost. It is a 1-2, so it's slightly more fragile. But it also has the Desert Rats attached to it. Deployment. Deal 1 damage to an enemy ground unit and pin it. The only difference is it has to be a ground unit. You can't target an air unit with it. But this is still amazing value. This card will be with us. We will be crafting another one. It is great tactical value. Hurricane Mark 1. 3 cost, 2 op cost Blitz Fighter. Later on we'll have better options, but for now, if we can get the credits through War Machine to be able to operate this, if we have 5 credits to put this down and attack with it, it can be very potent. If we have 6 credits to put this down, close air support it, and attack with it, it can be even more potent. You will make use of this. It's kind of what you're ramping to. Won't stay with us forever, but early on in the game, you can get value out of this card. Fortification is a 3 cost British order that just says give your HQ plus 7 defense. When you see it, if you have the 3 credits to play it, you probably should, because extra HQ defense just gives us longevity. It's not going to stick with us forever because eventually we'll be trading this out for better cards, but at the moment, that extra longevity can be really useful. Coldstream Guards. Now this is very much tech early for this deck until we can evolve it better, but it's important to talk about because this is critical to the early way you play this deck and totally irrelevant in the later deck because we don't include it. But in the early deck, what this is a 3 cost, 1 op cost infantry with guard, which is useful because we can use it to protect our bombers and our HQ. In a perfect world, we put this down so that it is adjacent to our HQ on one side and then has 2 British aircraft to its other side, which means that we can then target one of the central British aircraft with close air support to buff this and keep this covering the HQ and the more critical of our British fighters. Positioning is very important in this deck. We'll talk about that in tactics. It also has a deployment effect, and it says add naval support to your hand. And this is where the tech comes in. A naval support is a 2 cost order, and it says change the attack on target unit to be equal to its defense. If we can combo this with a gladiator or one of our single swordfish that has been hit, particularly if we can get it on our single swordfish, which has been hit by cup of tea, that swordfish suddenly becomes a 5/5 bomber. This card is very important early in the game because it can give you the big bodies that you need to finish it. Many of your units have much higher defense than they do, including actually Coldstream Guard have higher defense than they do attack. So this has good value, and making good use of it will help you. P40 Kitty Hawk. This is the elite card that you get from your British Progress. It is a 3 cost, 2 op cost, 2/3 fighter, which is decent value, and its deployment effect is incredibly useful because it says deal 2 damage to an enemy ground target. Now, first of all, obviously, this can be used to remove difficult, like smokescreened or otherwise protected defensive ground units, but also this can be 3 cost win the game if your opponent has 2 HQ defense left and you have the 3 credits to pay for it. Because yes, this targets a ground target, which includes your opponent's HQ. Just something to be aware of. Overall, we're going to keep this around. It's a decent card. 6-pounder. This won't stay for long, but early on we can make use of it. So this is a 3 cost, 1 op cost, 2/1 artillery. Artillery, like bombers, can ignore guard when targeting. and it deals double damage against tanks. You're going to see quite a lot of tanks early on in the game, so this can be useful. Doesn't have blitz, so it's quite slow, but if you can get cup of tea or close air support or both on this by positional play, it can become a potent tool because it can keep firing, and artillery is really good for removing your opponent's fighters till you have a better way. Convoy HX 175. We love this card because it's 3 cost to draw 2 cards. It's just card draw. It gets us into our deck, and that's great. This is a ubiquitous British card, which you're going to see in a lot of British decks because it's just good value. Card draw is always good. The Alliance. This is 5 cost US order that says give all your non-US units +2/+2. Won't stick around forever because eventually we have better buffs, but early on we can make use of this if we get into a late game having survived by gaining some HQ defense and gotten a good position with some decent British units on the board. Giving them all +2/+2, given the number of our units that can directly target the enemy's HQ, can be huge. War Bonds. This is the second half of our ramp package, which is to say gaining extra credit slot access, is 5 cost and you gain 2 extra credit slots, and you draw an additional card at the beginning of your next turn. Once you get to it, it's good value. You need to have the spare credits to play it. Sometimes there will be better things to do, but it is not a bad card to have in hand because it can really give you an edge. The Hampton Mark I. This is a 5 cost, 2 op cost Blitz bomber, which on the face of it isn't frankly great because it's very expensive. But it is 3/3 and 7 credits to deal 3 direct damage to your enemy HQ as long as they don't have fighters isn't bad. And if you can get some buffs on it, this can do work. It's still not a highly valued card and not one that's going to stick around into the late game, but early game, it's got enough of a body and punch that it can be very useful. Do not sleep on making use of this card if you've got the credits, and it is again one of the reasons that we have a ramp in the early game to gain extra credit slots to access these. Speaking of things which we are using our extra credit slots to access, this is the air contribution from our US ally. This is the B-25 Mitchell. It's a 6 cost, 3 op cost bomber. So a lot of the time, actually, once we've deployed this, we're not operating it very often because 3 op cost can be very pricey for us, although if we've ramped it can be good. The key though is that when you deploy it, it deals 3 damage to a random enemy unit. This can be great, especially if your opponent has only 1 unit on the board and 3 damage is going to destroy it. Plus, a 4/5 bomber is not nothing. 3 cost to deal 4 damage to your opponent's HQ once you've got fighters out the way again is good value. This card can be good, and it is one of the things we ramp towards. Carpet Bombing. This is our board clear. This is a 7 cost order that says deal 3 damage to all enemy units. Doesn't target the enemy HQ, but it's very, very useful for clearing a busy board state that our opponents built so that we have time to operate, and again is another thing that our ramp can get us access to. And the final thing that we're ramping to, and sometimes our big finisher, is the Lancaster Mark I. The Lancaster Mark I is not the best of Britain's big bombers, but it's only a limited card, so we have access to it without having to craft it, and it is really good value. I speak a lot about the value of this card to players playing Britain, because it is a 9 cost 7/4 bomber with 3 op cost and blitz, which means that if you have 12 credits, this is 7 targeted damage, which is not nothing and can win games. And if you can get it down and buff it, it's incredibly hard to remove. There are many, many times when this is going to win you the game. You have 12 credits, your opponent's been battered down, they've got a guard up and you can't get to them otherwise, and then you drop the Lancaster. It's a good card. Okay, let's talk about His Majesty's Chosen. I said we would. So I've pulled up on the screen the pool of British elite units that are in the game, of which there are quite a few. There are in fact 16. These are things that you can get from His Majesty's Chosen. So when you play His Majesty's Chosen, you will get 3 of these cards shown to you, and you can choose one of them to add to hand. And that can be overwhelming. So we're going to talk about these units and the relative value of them. We start with the 85 Pioneer Company, which is one of the most potent units in the game. This is a 1 cost, 4 op cost, 0 for infantry, which looks terrible, stat-wise. However, has smokescreen to protect it, so it can only be targeted by orders. Can't target your opponent unless they can remove the smokescreen, cannot attack this with units, unless you move it. And the card text is amazing. The first order you play each turn costs 1 less. So every turn, the first order that you play is at -1 cost to a minimum of 0. So you can get free cup of tea or close air support off this. If you see this early in the game, it is almost certainly a great pick. 6th Air Landing Brigade. This is a 2-1-1-4 infantry with Fury. Fury means that it can attack twice. And it also is potent for its card text, because its card text says when a friendly unit would deal 1 combat damage, it deals 3 instead. This is all of your little fighters and bombers. Really strong. It's not as strong as 85 Pioneer in my opinion, but this can be a very useful card to have. We have the Oxford. This is a 2 cost, 1 op cost, 1-3 fighter, and it has when a ground unit is deployed, its attack becomes equal to its defense. We really aren't fussed about this at all. E40 Kitty Hawk. We've already got 1 in deck, but if we see this and there isn't a better pick, this is never a bad thing to take. 3rd Canadian Division. This is a salvage focus card. I'm not going to talk about it, we don't need it. Spitfire Mark IIA. This is a 4 cost, 2 op cost, 4-4 fighter, and it has deployment. It's +2/+2 if your enemy controls an air unit. It gets Fury if they don't. If you're, as you deploy this, if your opponent has an air unit, it is a 6, which makes it really good for fighting air. However, if your opponent doesn't have air units, it gets Fury, which means it can attack twice. This is a very strong pick. The Bowfighter 6F. 5 cost, 2 op cost, 4-5 fighter, so it's a decent body, and it has British air units you deploy get +2/+2. If we can afford it, and it's the right time in the game, which is mid-game, and we are getting ready to throw out some more air units, this is great. Situational, but very strong. M4 Firefly. 5 cost, 2 op cost, 5-4 tank. The only time we're really pulling this is if there's a big threat on the board, and we have effectively 7 credits, because we dropped 2 to play His Majesty's Chosen. If there is a big threatening tank on the board, this can be a good pick, because deployment, deal 5 damage to an enemy tank, can remove that threat. But on the whole, we're probably not taking this card. Number 43, Commando. Commando focused card, we're just going to ignore it. Sexton. This is a ubiquitously strong British elite, which can be well worth considering if you're in a position to play it and get value out of it. Sexton is a 5 cost, 2 op cost, 3-4 artillery, and it has deployment, pin an enemy unit. Kinda cool. At the start of your turn, pin that unit again. So, you deploy Sexton, and as long as your enemy can't remove Sexton, you permanently pin one of their units. This card wins games. It's not something we go for early, but it is something we consider later, and it is certainly worth considering when we're looking at His Majesty's Chosen if we're in a position to use it. A34 Comet, 6 cost, 2 op cost, 6/6 tank with heavy armor 1, which means it reduces combat damage it takes by 1. When this unit deals damage to enemy HQ, draw a card. We're never picking this, we're not tank based. The Beaufighter TF MK10, Mark 10 Beaufighter TF. This is a 6 cost, 2 op cost, 4/4 bomber, and it has any unit that attacks this unit takes 3 damage first. It's not great. Occasionally, if you've nothing else, like if you really see nothing else, you might take it, but realistically, you're not. The Mosquito FB Mark 6. This is a 6 cost, 2 op cost, 4/4 fighter. This is basically the big brother of the Kitty Hawk, and it's a deployment, deal 3 damage to an enemy unit. This can be good for all of the reasons that the Kitty Hawk can be good, it's just more expensive. Churchill Mark 3 Avray. It's a 7 cost, 2 op cost, 5/7 heavy armored 1 tank, and has a deployment. All enemy ground units must retreat. Retreat means move back 1 rank, whether that's from the front line into the support line, or from the support line back into hand. If you push something from the support line back into hand and your opponent's hand is full, that card is discarded. This card is amazing. There are times you're going to take this to push back an enemy ground offensive, and it has great value. Not a super common include in air decks, but it is a good value card, and off His Majesty's Chosen can be great. The Lancaster B3. This is a 7 cost, 3 op cost, 5/4 blitz bomber. And it has when this unit damages an HQ, cards in the enemy hand cost +1 credit, and yes, it's permanent, and yes, it attacks. This card is amazing if you want to really make your opponent have a bad day. It's not the world's most common include in Brit air decks because it's not super fitting the rest of what you do, but it can be good, and if you're in a tough position, this can really slow your opponent down. Finally, and definitely not least, is the Wellington. This is a card that we will want later. When is questionable, but if we see this off of His Majesty's Chosen, we're quite often going to take this. The Wellington is a 7 cost, 3 op cost, 4/3 blitz bomber, which in and of itself is really good. 10 points to deploy and deal 4 damage to the enemy HQ is okay, but the great thing about this is in your hand, this unit costs 2 less every time you give an order, which means that you can get this down to a 0 cost, 3 op cost blitz bomber, which is a 3, deal 4 damage to the enemy HQ. And we play enough orders that this will happen. If you see this, unless you have another tactical problem, this is almost always your best pick. 85 Pioneer, probably better value, but because you're probably playing His Majesty's Chosen later, this has probably got finish value for you. Anyway, it's a very good card. And that's it. That's His Majesty's Chosen and my advice on what you might or might not want to take from it. Right, that's the base deck. Tactics-wise, it's pretty much going to be about careful use of orders and positions. So you have some pin, which you're going to make use of to slow your opponent down. You're going to want to get your Greyhounds into the front line to slow the enemy down again, because you want to buy yourself time to deploy units into and operate in the support line. When you do get your aircraft into the support line, you want to be able to get close air support onto them, and also drop quite regularly. You'll get great value out of Cup of Tea, especially if later on you can proc the naval support order from your Coldstream Guards. As I discussed briefly while talking about it, one of the key things to learn in this deck is positioning. So the positioning of your units in the support line and the timing of when you push things forward versus when you play orders can be huge. because the difference between deploying a 1-3 Greyhound and pushing it forward, and being able to deploy a 1-3 Greyhound, give it +1/+1, and then push it forward, honestly can be game-winning in early game matchups, because those really survivable frontline bodies are very valuable. Oddly, it's sometimes better value in the long term for your strategy to forego getting, even if you have 3 aircraft in the backline and you're about to deploy your Greyhound, it is often worth deploying that Greyhound in such a way that you buff 2 aircraft with close air support and the Greyhound missing out one of the aircraft, because you get the body can go into the front line and slow your opponent down. And that's the thing, because your big vulnerability in this deck is that bombers don't deal combat damage back when attacked, which means that they are vulnerable once the enemy can get to them. This is why we have guards. This is why we have Greyhounds. This is why often it is worth pushing up your Coldstream Guard, unless your opponent has artillery or bombers to directly attack your HQ, because just clogging up the front line so your opponent can't get to your bombers is good. This is also why we like Pin. Again, also play the long game. You have HQ defense gain, and often it is worth buffing up your bombers and targeting enemy units to just clear the board. If your enemy doesn't have units to operate with, they present less of a threat to you, and you are almost certainly in the long game, because you have HQ defense gain, you have card draw, and you have big late game bombers that you can buff and drop. You do not mind the long, especially at lower ranks. There will be lots of very aggro-y decks. If you just keep removing all of their threats and hold on, you'll do well. Also, there will be times when on this deck you bizarrely win games with not a lot of HQ defense left, because you can hit very hard late game. Basically, this deck leverages survivability and the ability to do very targeted damage. As I say, its big weakness is if your enemy gets early position on you. That's not good, which is why you should probably be looking to see a Greyhound in your opening hand and mulliganing if you don't, because you want something. If you haven't got a Greyhound or some form of pin, you are in serious danger of your opponent establishing good frontline position, and that can be bad, because it's very hard for us to come back from it, because we don't have a lot of blitz, and we don't have bodies to trade. We're not interested in trading, we're interested in value. Our bombers don't trade, they just blow stuff up and take no damage in return. Fighters are, of course, targets of priority for our fighters and ground units to remove them so that our bombers can operate freely. And that's the basic tactics, and they're not massively going to change as we go late game, we're just going to refine them. Speaking of late game, we'll go and take a look at the late game version of this deck, and I'll talk you through it. Right, welcome to the late game version of our Barebones Brit Air deck. As you can see, I'm still on the same account, which means lots of these cards are grayed out for me because I did what I recommended earlier. There is a code down below and I imported it, and used it to import the deck in. You can import a deck even if you don't own the cards in it, which is great because it means you can keep this and see how close you're getting to the kind of deck you want. We'll run down the list and talk about what we've got and why we're using them. Gladiator Mark 1. So we have the Gladiator Mark 1 and we've capped out to have 3 in total. 1-3 fighter, this is one of our early drop air units. It's not quite as good as the Swordfish because it's a fighter, not a bomber, but it's still really good value and we can still make great use of it. Number 9, Commando. Now, we have a couple of these in deck, and the reason is that these are an odd unit. They fit into all sorts of different places, but I personally really like them. So they are a 1-cost, 1-op cost, 1-1 infantry. The actual body is terrible and mostly useless, and you're going to throw it into the front line and it's going to die. Might just slow an enemy unit down. But the deployment effect is incredibly powerful when you have bombers on board, because what it says is set the defense of a target enemy unit 1. That is correct. If your opponent has a 12-12 body on the board, You can put this down, set its defense to 1, and plink it to death with a gladiator or a swordfish. Gladiator, of course, would die. The swordfish, even better, wouldn't. This is what this card is there for. This is for tactical removal. There will be games where you literally see this and the pair of them sit in your hand the whole game through because you don't have anything to play them on. But when you do need them, they're amazing. Swordfish. Got 3 of them in the final deck because these are pivotal to our deck. They are amazing. They are the 1/3 bomber that we've talked about before. They are everything we want. A 1/3 bomber with 1 operation cost, buffable, Brit Air, it's all of the things that we want. Is probably the defining card of this deck. Greyhound, we're still running 3 of these for all the reasons we did before, giving us some frontline presence, buffing the support line. They're just good value, and they will continue to be. Close air support. Of course, this is the heart of our deck. We use the buff. We have crafted an extra one, so we end up with a total of 4 of these, and we're going to use them liberally. It's an amazing buff, and it will continue to be. Naval power, we're still running a couple of these for all the same reasons. HQ defense gain is good, and pin is very useful for us to slow our enemy down until we can blow up their threats with. For freedom, talked about this previously. We're running 2 of these because this buff is just great. +1/+1, draw a card. We love this. Bomber Mafia is interesting because this is actually, when we get to the crafting guide, a card that I recommend you craft for this deck, even though it's not one that we're crafting on our US allies. Usually we only pull allied cards from the ones that we are crafting on that nation. In this case, I really believe it is worth burning a couple of open special cards. Get this card, it is really that good. Air deck. Bomber Mafia is a 2-cost order, and it says develop a US bomber. That means you'll see 3 US bombers, and either one from the whole pool of US bombers, which is not half bad. Pick 1 to add to your hand, and then it says deal 2 damage to all enemies if you have 6 or more unspent credits. So if you have 8 credits, this is get a bomber in hand and deal 2 damage to all enemies, including the HQ. You will make use of this. It's not always going to be super critical, but late game it can be really powerful. The Albacore, still with us, we craft another one, same deal, it's just good value bomber with pin. Absolutely no reason not to run this. It's great for slowing down enemy ground units. Always worth remembering to prioritize using this on ground units so you don't accidentally use naval power on a ground unit and then realize this can't pin the air unit. Ingenuity, this is a one-of in this deck, and it is just in there to get us some more British or US bomber access. It is a 2-cost order, and it says develop a British or US bomber, so you'll see 3 cards pulled from the total pool of British and US bombers available in the game, and pick 1 to add to hand. Because this deck really wants more elites than we have in the first 100 levels of the game, things like develop can be very useful for us to get us extra tools. His Majesty's Chosen, still with us for exactly the same reason. The Shark Mark III. I love this card. This, Brit Air is probably one of my favourite decks in the game, because my first, homebrew deck that I gained the early levels in the game was a Brit US Air deck. And then I refined it with some help from excellent J King, and now Brit Air is back in a different way, and this is one of the major reasons it is. The Shark Mark III is a 2-cost, 1-op cost, 1/2 bomber, which is okay, but it has an amazing deployment effect. Deal damage to target enemy equal to friendly air unit. So, depending on what your state is, this is dealing 2, 3, or 4 damage to an enemy target, which can include the enemy's HQ. Even more if somehow you've got air units in the front line, which you'd be surprised may happen. There will be times when you've pushed up your gladiators to make room for more bombers. This thing's great because you can use it for removal, you can use it to target enemy HQ, and you get a body on the board in return. We run 2 of these and we will never regret doing so. Sea Embargo. Speaking of great, we run a couple of these. There's an argument for running more, you could drop other things, but 2 I think is about the right number. This is a 2-cost that says, give a target unit +1/+1. If it's an air unit, develop a British air unit with 2 or less attack. So, again, you'll get the buff, you'll see 3 British air units with 2 or less attack, and pick one of them to add to hand. There are some very good choices. Kitty Hawk's in there, the bombers that we like are in there. You can get a couple of duffs, but for the most part, you can pull some very good cards from them. Still running 4 Convoy HX-175 because card draw. Still running the Kitty Hawk for all the reasons that we were previously. Really useful. Sincerely Yours. This is an elite that we will craft. In fact, this is the first elite we will craft because I consider this to be the most ubiquitous and functional British elite in the entire game. Because it fits everywhere. And it fits everywhere because it says for 4 cost, give your HQ +6 defense and draw 2 cards. It's just amazing. You will learn to love this card if you play Britain. HMS Hermes. Now, this is an interesting one. I run this in this deck because we do not have access to its bigger brother, and we don't have the spare elite to craft it until much, much later. In fact, we craft it at level 100. This card is 6 cost. Fill your support line with Swordfish Mark 1. The Swordfish Mark 1, of course, is the 1/3 bomber. Now, on the face of this isn't great, because the best you can get out of this is 4 cost with the bombers support line. But late game, when you have the credits to spare, being able to do that can be really good, because then you can buff the life out of them, and there's enough of them being deployed that you can probably guarantee a few of them surviving before they all get removed. It's not amazing. This is not a card which is played at high level because it is not cost effective. I do think it's a bit overpriced, but we can make decent use of it, and that's why we run 2 of them. You'll excuse the fact that, for some reason, the deck had loaded incorrectly. I may possibly have had the wrong code. This is the second elite that we craft. The code, by the way, down below will import the correct deck. This one had 1 elite which was wrong. This is HMS Illustrious. This is the big brother of Hermes. It is 3 cost, add 2 Swordfish Mark 1 to your support line, and give them Blitz. It's a strict upgrade, and it's amazing. It gives us blitzing versions of one of our best cards at 3 cost. That means that we can drop them and operate them for a total of 5 cost, which means if we've got 6 credits, we can drop them, buff them with close air support, and attack with both of them on the same turn. This card is a really good value, and a huge part of how this deck functions. Finally, the Lancaster Mark 1 is still with us, and is still incredibly good value. There's nothing else to say, really. It's a great finisher until we can upgrade it to the Wellington, which eventually we will do. And there she is, the final deck. As I say, the code down below will not have the error in it. It will be the correct list. Do not worry, I will fix that. Sometimes errors happen when we're creating things. Anyway, let's go talk tactics. Honestly, tactically, we're doing much the same thing. We're just doing it far more efficiently with this deck. We are relying less and less on different bits and pieces down there. And we have a much more refined selection of air, which is the heart of this deck. It is still all about careful positioning and timing of buffs, but we have less fiddly buffs, like the old combination of Cup of Tea into naval support is off of a Coldstream Guards is not something we have to worry about anymore. We have things like Sea Embargo, which just saves us all the faffery. We have access to cards like Ingenuity and Hermes and Illustrious to get us access to more bombers if our opponent starts clearing us down. On the whole, not a huge amount has changed. There are a few tweaks that you could make depending on your personal position. Dropping, once you have access to HMS Illustrious, dropping one of the one remaining Hermes, because you'll obviously one of the remaining Hermes can be dropped, and you could bring back carpet bombing, pretty good value. And you can play around and tweak the value on this, and there are more elite that we want in this deck, and we'll cover those when we talk about the crafting path. Right, crafting path spreadsheet. I do a lot of this. I think it's a very good way of visualizing your crafting path. What this is a list of the wild cards that you will have available in the first 100 levels of the game, and my opinions on what you would add when to build up to the final deck that we just talked about. At level 14, we get a limited British wildcard. It is British only, so if it says limited nation on this list, it must be British. If it says limited open, it can be any nation. We use this one to craft a Gladiator Mark 1. Then the two standard cards that we get at level 16 allow us to get another close air support for a full 4 and our first Sea Embargo, so we're building up on our buffs. Then we get two more standard wildcards at 19. We get our second Sea Embargo, and we get a number 9 Commando for the removal purposes we talked about. Level 20, we get a special nation wildcard, and we craft the Shark. As I mentioned, the Shark is just really great. It's very, very versatile. Level 23, we craft our second and final number 9 Commando. And then we have open standard wildcards that you could use to go and craft different things. If, for example, you find that you are preferring Sea Embargo over number 9 Commando, you could craft another couple of Sea Embargos. All the standard cards I recommend are already crafted, so you can get a bit extemporaneous, try some different stuff. 24, another limited nation wildcard. Time to get a Swordfish, which is really good. Then again, we get to level 33, another Swordfish, so now we have 3 Swordfish and 3 Gladiators, which is always a good place to be. And then our next special nation wildcard is at level 37. We complete our set of Shark, which is always a good sign. And then at level 39 and level 42, we pick up HMS Hermes to tide us over until we can get access to elites to use things like Illustrious or find different elites. These are cards that will eventually be replaced by better elites, but these limiteds hold the slot until we have those. Because this is quite an expensive deck, craft-wise. Then we skip all the way down to level 47, where we get an open special wildcard, and unusually for these guides, instead of recommending a British card, I recommend you use this to craft Bomber Mafia for the reasons I mentioned in the video. Our first elite happens at level 49, and as I said, it's Sincerely Yours. You could argue that this is not as much on our archetype as Illustrious or some other things that we could put in. The thing about Sincerely Yours is it's just value and is going to be great in lots of Britain decks, and that gives you versatility. If you are absolutely focused on this archetype, you might want to craft Illustrious now, hope to pick up Sincerely Yours later, and then use the level 100 wildcard to get some of the other elites we'll talk about in a bit. But, personally, I think you'll be absolutely fine with Sincerely Yours and get good value. Limited open wildcard here gets us Ingenuity for the extra bomber. Get another special at level 70 as a nation wildcard, and that completes our set of the Albacore, at which point we're kind of done with nation-specific specials. We do have a free one later on. Our next open special wildcard is at level 97, and that's another Bomber Mafia. Finally, at level 100, I recommend HMS Illustrious, because it's such a strong card for the archetype. So over here, we have a list of elites that you might want to keep your eyes open for, and targets for if you have elite wildcards. If you open these in packs, you should definitely be putting them in your deck. First one that we're looking at is Wave After Wave. This is a 6-cost order, and it says deal 2 damage to all enemy units. If this is the second order you've given this turn, instead deal 4. This is just great board clear. It's used well. Obviously, it means it has a minimum cost of 7 unless you have Pioneers, which we'll get to in a minute, because you have to play another order first, but it's great. Speaking of Pioneers, we talked about these in the video when we were talking about His Majesty's Chosen. 85 Pioneer is an incredibly potent card in any Britain deck that uses orders, and we do, because it reduces the cost of the first order you play in turn by 1. Definitely worth including if you get it. 6th Air Landing Brigade, same deal. It's the one that ups combat damage dealt by units that deal 1 combat damage, instead deal 3, which, as I said, hits our bombers beautifully. Ultra. Now, this is an incredibly powerful card. Ultra is a countermeasure, and it is a 3-cost countermeasure, so you activate it and it holds up, and if it triggers, it works. If it doesn't, you keep it and can activate it again. When Ultra is triggered is any time your enemy gives an order, counter that order, means it cancels, and you draw a card. Ultra is a very potent card, which you will see played a lot in Britain decks. It's probably not a super urgent craft for you, because it takes some getting used to using, but if you open it in a pack, you should definitely be including it. We have the Spitfire Mark IIA. This is the really high-value fighter, which is either Fury or 6/6, depending on what value you get when you deploy it, depending on the state of your enemy's air. Can be really, really good. Again, it's not a super urgent craft, but it is great and well worth including. The Wellington, of course, 7-cost bomber that reduces its cost every time you give an order. This card is amazing. If you see it, you should include it in the deck. It's very good for all the reasons we talked about in the video. However, we do have Lancaster, which is doing a good finisher job for us at the moment. Wellington's just great because we can play it so much earlier. The Sexton, so this is the 5-cost artillery that pins a unit and then repins it at the start of every turn as long as it's not destroyed. Again, this is just an incredibly utilitarian British elite. Britain has some very good elites that are very good in air, which is why this list is as long as it is. And finally, we have Royal Research. Now, I'm not going to talk about this in any great detail because I've done a whole video on the research cards and you should go look at it. But Royal Research is potentially a valid include in this deck, primarily because Radar exists as the first option in it, which gets you card draw and HQ defense. And that is primarily what I would run this for. Synthetic Rubber can also be good because it gives the target unit +4 defense and sets its stack equal to its defense. That's the second tier 1, which can turn one of your light bombers into a finisher. And you're probably not really in it for the big ones. But anyway, go check it out. It can be a good include, and certainly if you open it in a pack, I recommend you doing. That's the crafting guide for this deck. And I hope you can follow it easily enough. Obviously, I'm going to leave the screen up for a sec so that you can screen capture it, anything like that. Obviously, these elites, you can pick and choose what you're popping out your deck for it. HMS Hermes is definitely a good target once you've got Illustrious, because Illustrious is strictly better. But there are other cards that you can pull out and changes you can make, but overall, this deck does pretty well. Okay, that's it. That is the bare bones British Air Guide from the base deck all the way up to the late game deck. Along with some tactical advice. As always, I hope you find it useful. I hope you have success with the decks. and let me know how you get on. Comment, like, follow, subscribe, join the Discord, all that stuff from the links down below. As always, stay well, be good human beings, and I will catch you next time.